Hey, welcome to Motivation Monday with Pastor Josh. Motivation is the act or instance of motivating, providing with a reason to act in a certain way. We're going to look at what that looks like today on this edition of Motivation Monday.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast today as we continue our progression through the book Unoffendable by Brant Hansen. I really encourage you to pick one of these up if you haven't already. It's just been an awesome study that we've been going through. It's really relevant for where we're at right now with everything happening. Everybody's angry, and everyone's struggling with how to respond to each other. And this is such a relevant book. And so we are in chapter 13 today. The title of the chapter is The Big Question: What About Injustice? We've talked a few different times throughout the book. Brant talks about anger and how we should respond, and that anger isn't really what we want to choose. But nevertheless, and I've had this conversation too with people, is the first thing they say is, well, what about injustice? What about things that are not right? Shouldn't we be angry at the things that are not right? And how should we respond? Right now, I know with a lot of things that are going on, many people are using the injustices that they see as a right to be angry and to respond angrily towards other people. And so Brant really tackles this, and he does a great job. I'm going to jump into it, and I'm going to read several statements today, probably more than I have in previous podcasts, just because there's a lot of good material in here that articulates it pretty well. So I'm going to read through some of the things that he says here. He says, let's face it, we're positively in love with taking stands that cost us absolutely nothing. It turns out that the people who are often the most indignant voices in protests of justice are the least likely to part with their own resources to do anything about it. Anger and action are two very different things, and confusing the two actually hurts our efforts to set things right. Yes, he says, agreed. Do something. Take action. But if we don't get angry, we won't do anything. And he's quoting there. He says, but if we don't get angry, we won't do anything. And he says, really? Why? He says, you can't just do the right thing because it's the right thing? The Bible gives us ample commands to act, and never, and I thought this was really good, he says, and never, ever does it say to do it out of anger. Instead, we're motivated by something very different: love, and obedience born of love. The Bible gives us ample commands, but never does it command us to act with our anger. It's never commanded of us. Acting out of love, to show mercy, to correct injustices, to set things right, is beautiful. The condition of our hearts is not a side issue. Why we do what we do matters infinitely. This kind of love leaves an impression on one's enemies that anger simply never will. And I think we've seen that, right, with a lot of the stuff that's going on right now. He says this, he says, think about it. In order for us to justify our right to anger, we have to confuse ourselves with God, which I think is really, really key. So I'm going to read, he has a couple quotes in here from some pretty great examples. Martin Luther King Jr. is quoted in here after some situations that occurred. And it says, during his famous bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, King was blamed by the authorities for the lack of a settlement. He knew it wasn't fair, and he wrote about it in his autobiography, this is what Dr. King said. So that Monday, I went home with a heavy heart. I was weighed down by a terrible sense of guilt, remembering that on 2 or 3 occasions I had allowed myself to become angry and indignant. I had spoken hastily and resentfully. Yet I knew that this was no way to solve a problem. And then he says, you must not harbor anger. He's quoting the scripture. He says, I admonish myself. He says, you must be willing to suffer the anger of the opponent and yet not return anger. So King's response to this question of, aren't we supposed to be angry at injustice? Dr. King's response was that we were to be motivated by love. He himself, who was one of the greatest civil rights leaders in all of history, he himself declared that anger wasn't the way to handle injustice, that we shouldn't become angry at it, that we actually should be motivated by compassion and by love, that it actually brings about what we want. And then even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the German theologian, Professor Spy, who really was there in the middle of Germany trying to help Jews to find refuge. He was trying to overthrow the Nazi regime. He was trying to pastor people through a difficult time in history. And so he says this in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, which is one of my top 10 favorite books of all time. He talks about how he says, Jesus will not accept the common distinction between righteous indignation and unjustifiable anger. The disciple must be entirely innocent of anger, because anger is an offense against both God and his neighbor. And so, I mean, you can see just even he should have been angry, right, at the injustice against that was happening with the Nazi regime and with Adolf Hitler, and he chose something different. And so Brandt says, my anger isn't a sign of trust; it's the very opposite. And he quotes a scripture in Psalm 37. It says, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it causes harm. And then he ends his chapter with this thought. He says, choosing to be unoffendable or relinquishing my right to anger does not mean accepting injustice. That's important to hear. He says it means actively seeking justice and loving mercy while walking humbly with God, which he's quoting Micah 6:8. And he says, and that means remembering I'm not him. What a relief. And so really the challenge today is I know there's a lot of injustice in the world right now, and we're struggling with it, and rightfully so. But the response of many, many, many people today is to be angry and to throw stones. And it doesn't help. It does not help. It is not the way to handle it. Any solution that comes from angry people in reference to injustice. I've seen people screaming at each other in protests. I mean, it's crazy. I know people are angry, but the change that we want to see, the fruit of our anger isn't going to produce it. And so we have to really look at it and say, Lord, help us. We need to be able to respond to injustice with real justice that isn't motivated by anger. We have to respond with love and mercy and walk humbly with God. And so I pray that that's your heart cry. And if it isn't and there's some anger in you, would you bring that to the Lord, because that isn't going to bring about the justice that the world really needs. And so if we want to see justice, we have to come at it from a different angle. And so this has been another podcast from us. And so thanks for joining me today. We'll look forward to tomorrow, where we get a look at chapter 14 and see what God has for us as we study this book, Unoffendable, together. Thanks for joining me today.